I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, a whole bunch of issues in the headlines these days. The UN report on last summer's war in Gaza, issued by a commission of the United Nations Human Rights Council, which slams Israel and the IDF for human rights violations and war crimes. A scandalous report which the New York Times seems all too ready to endorse, accepting the report's description that when it comes to the actions of the IDF, quote, impunity prevails across the board. And Israelis used precision-guided weapons to inexplicably destroy residential buildings as if they were legitimate military targets. At the same time, a Supreme Court ruling dealing with the separation of powers between Congress and the President resurrects the question that's dogged U.S. foreign policy with respect to Israel. Why does every American administration, Democrat and Republican, refuse to recognize that Jerusalem is part of the State of Israel? And then there's Michael Oren's new book, Ally, which has generated enormous controversy within the Jewish community, as the former Israeli ambassador to the United States reveals behind closed doors details of the way the Obama administration purposefully distanced itself from Israel on the diplomatic front. And Oren's book has not only caused many American Jews to ask serious questions about President Obama and his Middle East policy, Oren has also evoked a good deal of criticism from Jews in Israel and in the United States for writing what some feel is a self-serving book that distorts Obama policy and plays armchair psychiatrist with the president. Well, in the midst of all the issues swirling around the Jewish community today, I'm so happy to have on our phones right now a man who's been a most eloquent and outspoken voice on the world Jewish scene, Eric Yoffie, former president of the Union For Reform Judaism, and a columnist now who writes for Haaretz, the Huffington Post, the Jerusalem Post, and he has his own website. You can read him there, ericyoffie.com. Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be with you, as always.
Okay. By the way, as someone who's always looking for a story to write about, for an issue to write about, this must be a great time for you. Every time you get up in the morning, there's another hot issue, yes?
That's true. We are not lacking for crises in the Jewish world right now.
All right, let's take them one at a time, Eric. Begin with the United Nations Human Rights Council's report on the war in Gaza. How did you respond to it, and how would you characterize it?
Jews have not taken it seriously. The State of Israel has not taken it seriously. The UN is not a moral agent here. In order to issue a moral critique, you have to be a moral agent. That is, you have to establish moral credibility. The UN simply has been unable and unwilling over the course of many years to deal with Israel in an objective fashion and in a moral fashion. So that being the case, they have not the right, they do not have the authority to produce such a report. I believe that Israel appropriately did not cooperate in this instance. They've done their own studies. Now, there are a whole variety of issues that arise when rockets are fired out of civilian centers. I mean, that certainly is the case. Mm-hmm. And I would hope that someone in the Israeli army is going to read the report for any elements that might offer some insight. But by and large, it is not a report that the Jewish world or the State of Israel is going to relate to.
But when you say it so well, and because you've said it this way, I want to now ask you to take a half step back with me. Neither you nor I are suggesting that we don't care about civilian casualties in Gaza and that we care very much about how Israel conducts any military operation. The New York Times piled on. The New York Times seems to say that the State of Israel targeted residential buildings, that it acted with impunity, that it was callous in the way it conducted this war. I'm asking you for the subtlety of the issue. While you care about how Israel operates, how do you judge the extent to which a Times endorsement of this report, which you rightly say, I believe, the State of Israel and most American Jews simply dismiss it. At the same time, we don't want to dismiss the problem of how does Israel conduct a war? How do you negotiate that for yourself?
Look, first of all, every civilian death is a tragedy. Every single one. And, as you indicated, we don't dismiss the problem. The problem is a serious problem. It's been discussed in depth repeatedly in the Jewish world and certainly in the State of Israel. If you fire rockets out of cities and if you use your civilians as shields, you're going to pose a terrible problem for the military of the State of Israel that has to protect its citizens. And we haven't resolved that problem. It's not going to be resolved in the short term. Israel will have to struggle with it. I believe, by and large, they've done a reasonably good job in doing so. I think if the New York Times wants to call upon the State of Israel to find an appropriate response and to call for the help of the world in dealing with these terribly difficult issues, fine. But I think they need to recognize the problematic dimension of any report that's issued by the UN, and particularly this committee of the UN.
Okay, Eric, you are known well in the Jewish community, and you have been long associated with the liberal wing of the Jewish community. If someone hears you now and says to you, Eric, does this mean you've moved to the right? How would you answer them?
Well, on this particular issue, it's not a new issue, and I've taken the same position here that I've taken for a long time.
Absolutely.
There are a whole variety of issues. Some fall easily into the right-left category, the hawk-dove category. In my view, the particular problem of rockets fired from Gaza by a group that is committed to the destruction of Israel, that is seemingly indifferent to the welfare of its own civilians, doesn't fall into those categories.
Yes.
The responsibility of Israel is to protect its citizens. No civilized state stands by while as many as 1 million citizens in its southern regions are under attack for an extended period of time.
Okay, but I want to make sure you and I address the subtlety of the Times editorial. And
well, I didn't see the Times editorial.
All right, it doesn't
so
matter.
I'm a bit of a disadvantage here.
This is the point, though. What the Times is saying, in essence, and what many people are saying, forget the Times, the criticism of Israel is, of course Israel has the right to defend itself. Of course Israel has the right to try to stop rockets from being fired into civilian territories. What Israel doesn't have the right to do, the critics say, which is what this commission report seems to say, is to indiscriminately return fire into residential areas, into hospitals where Palestinians are gathered in an attempt to avoid being hit when Israel goes after a legitimate military target. And the suggestion here is that while Israel does have the right to defend itself, it crossed the line, Eric. It went too far in how it conducted the war. And that's what I want you to speak to. How do you feel about that aspect of the Commission's report?
Based on my knowledge of the situation and the facts, I don't accept that. I think the Israelis did a reasonably good job with some errors, some tragic errors. They had mechanisms in place. They had officers specifically assigned to dealing with this question of what would be the collateral damage before any military response was made. I have not heard personally a compelling case that the things that were charged in that report were in fact true.
Exactly.
So I don't accept them. And look, it was Amos Oz who put this most poignantly. Many of us remember during the war itself. He said, "This is the problem. You're living in a house, and your neighbor across the street sits in a chair, puts his son on his lap, and starts firing a machine gun at you. What do you do in that case? And he creates for us this image that's enormously powerful, because the fact is there's simply no easy answer that anybody can give.
Yes.
I have not been convinced by this report or any other that there is an answer that Israel should have grasped that would have solved all these problems that people are now talking about after the fact.
Yes.
Israel is not always right. In this case, I believe that they got it right. They deserve our support, even as they must continue to struggle with the issue to do better in any instance in the future when such a situation might recur.
All right, comment on two more things that the report said. One, it criticized Israel for not holding soldiers accountable if they engaged in human rights violations. My own sense, Eric, is it's the exact opposite. What's your sense?
I agree with you.
Okay.
There were soldiers who were put on trial.
Absolutely.
Israel was enormously sensitive to the implications of individual responsibility. Given, look, this is the third Gaza war.
Yes.
Since 2008, patterns have been established here. So for moral reasons as well as for practical reasons, I think Israel made every reasonable effort to do that. So it's a criticism that I reject. And again, I haven't read through the report completely. I've read a summary of the report. I didn't find those arguments to be compelling.
Okay. Also, there was a criticism of the IDF for using warning bombs. And this was something that was made fun of by Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. And I was taken aback when the report, in essence, suggested that Israel's warning bombs were themselves a provocation because they scared the people who endured the warning bombs. Any comment?
Well, look, what the report said is Israel took a variety of steps in order to warn civilians, in order to minimize casualties, that some of these steps were effective and some were not. And they mentioned those warning bombs as a step that was not effective, and that may be the case. I mean, again, I don't know enough to comment beyond that, but the report did indicate that dropping leaflets, for example, was effective, and was an attempt to clear out the area before military action was undertaken. It may be that this particular mechanism did not do what was intended, in which case Israel will need to learn the lesson if, heaven forbid, there is additional trouble in the future.
Okay. Last question on this issue. When you see the criticism leveled by the Commission, when you see, again, the Times and others piling on, what do you say to yourself about the motivation? Why does this happen when you and I believe most of the sane world, sees this issue so clearly? What's behind it, Eric?
Well, look, on the one hand, there is hostility to Israel and to Jews beyond what we would hope there might otherwise be. On the other hand, Israel is a democratic country, which for a whole variety of reasons that we don't have time to discuss now, is at the center of the attention of the media and the entire Western world, and it gets closer scrutiny than anyone else. Now, there are certain advantages to the Jewish state that result from that, and there are certain disadvantages that result from that. But look, you have more news people in Israel than you do in any Middle Eastern country,
Absolutely.
even though there are atrocities taking place in all the surrounding countries that are never covered at all. And why is that? Because Israel is a democratic country that, first of all, allows such people to be there, and where it's safe for them to be there. So these are covered in a way that simply doesn't happen elsewhere. Doesn't happen in Iraq, and doesn't happen in Syria, and doesn't happen in all of the other trouble spots. So there are a whole variety of reasons here. Be that as it may, some positive, some negative, it's a reality. Israel's contended with it for a long time. They'll have to contend with it in the future.
Okay. Moving on to the second issue. The Supreme Court decision, which really was dealing with the separation of powers, once again raised the issue, why is the United States refusing to recognize that Jerusalem is part of Israel? And the United States State Department, and again, it's been administrations, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they've all said the same thing. Jerusalem is such a hot issue topic that until the parties themselves work out a settlement of Jerusalem, the United States does not want to seem to be lobbying for one position or another. As a result, the United States refuses to say that Jerusalem is a part of Israel. Does that bother you?
Does it bother me? On some level, it does bother me. Look, I don't believe this is the central issue that Israel is facing right now. I mean, it faces existential concerns of many sorts, unfortunately, tragically. But as you have correctly stated, no president, Republican or Democrat, has done this or will do it. That's a reality. And that being a reality, it seems to me that we shouldn't spend too much time focusing on something that we are simply incapable of changing.
Mm-hmm. Those who feel strongly about this feel that because the United States is not recognizing Jerusalem as a part of Israel, in essence, they are in fact prejudicing the outcome and prejudicing also the legitimacy of the State of Israel. Does any of that resonate with you?
Look, I believe that ultimately, I believe in a two-state solution. It makes sense to divide countries. It makes less sense to divide cities. So, a united Jerusalem is something that I support in principle. But having said that, it's an open issue in the eyes of the world and in the eyes of the United States and all of Israel's allies. They believe it is best left till later. And so do I see this as an effort to delegitimize Israel? And my answer is no, not in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to me it's a practical political approach, not one that I support necessarily, but that I understand. And again, I don't believe this should be at the top of our priority list. We have Iran to worry about.
Yes.
So at a time when you're faced with a nuclear threat from Iran, I don't think that this is our top priority.
Okay. Again, I think you say it well, and you say it as I try to say it as well. It does bother me, Eric, but it doesn't rise to the level where I think the Jewish community should be making a commotion over it. It does reflect, in my mind, an unfortunate view of the American administration, and I sort of feel that if the United States ever said to the Palestinian world, of course Israel is a part of the State of Israel, and we're still supportive of a two-state solution, that Israel would be helped. But again, I think you're right, it does not rise to a level of critical concern. I want to turn now to Oren's book, Michael Oren's book, Ally, and you know how much, I mean, it is the book of the year. You know, we've had Yossi Klein Halevi's book, then we had Ari Shavit's book. This year it'll be Michael Oren's book. And there are people who are both saying, look what Oren has now revealed, and he is in some way telling the truth, and we now have more understanding of the way in which President Obama has distanced himself from Israel, and he doesn't want to stand right next to Israel. He wants there to be some daylight when it comes to the diplomatic scene. And then there are those who have just said that Oren's account is factually incorrect, that it was inappropriate for him to write the book. So my first question is, and I really should give you a chance to say how familiar you are with it. The book is really only like a week or 10 days old. But do you have any sense at all of where you stand on the Michael Oren Ally controversy?
Yes, well, I got the book 2 days ago. And actually, I had it a week ago, but I was out of the country. So I've had a chance to read substantial sections of it, and as well as a lot of supporting material on his various op-eds that he wrote in preparation for the release. So I'm very ambivalent about the book. I'm positive about some aspects, meaning, I agree, for example, with much of his critique on the Iran issue. I'm deeply worried about Iran. I think the administration has gotten that wrong. But having said that, on balance, I'm disturbed by the book. I think, by and large, those people are most critical are people who hated President Obama to begin with. They see this as further proof. Those who are more positive towards the administration are saying that this was a political, matter for Oren, who wants to advance his own career and sell more copies and so on. There were clearly some aspects of the book that I believe were factually wrong and were off base and were inappropriate. Look, generally speaking, when you write a book like this, and particularly if you're a historian, you write it when you are no longer, in the midst of the situation yourself.
That's right.
And with those that you are writing about are no longer serving.
That's right.
So Oren, who's a very distinguished historian, in this case is no longer ambassador, but he's a member of Knesset and a party that's part of the ruling coalition. Obama is still president. That isn't, generally speaking, the way a serious historian would approach such matters. So I think in structural terms, it was a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
It is a book now that is seen as a political book, meaning that it has implications, again, in terms of his own career and his own political ambitions, and that's meant to undermine an administration which is very strongly opposed by Israel's current prime minister and by certainly many members of his party.
Yes.
So from that point of view, I think that's kind of the backdrop for the broader issue.
Okay. There have been those who've pointed out that Oren's reputation was of something of a liberal, that he was not a huge fan of Netanyahu, even though he was the ambassador under Netanyahu's government, and that very often the things he said resonated with the liberal wing of the Jewish community. Now he writes a book, and incidentally, your comment about how is it appropriate for him to write it now? The only thing that's interesting to me, Eric, is that other members of Obama's administration have written, kiss and tell books at a time when one would expect them to also wait at least until the president had completed his second term. But that aside, there are people who've said that what Oren is saying is that the president did humiliate Netanyahu, that the president did condemn Israel during the Gaza war, that he did not confront the Palestinian Authority or Abbas with the same kind of criticism, and thus he reinforced Palestinian extremism and intransigency. And so my question for you is, to what extent do you feel that Oren's depiction of the White House, depiction of Obama's attitude towards the Muslim world on the one hand, and his attempt to, again, create some daylight diplomatically, not in terms of military aid, not in terms of intelligence, but in terms of diplomacy, to what extent do you feel that criticism of Oren's is legitimate?
Look, the daylight issue, I was present at that meeting, by the way, in the White House in 2009, where the question was asked and answered. But let me state this inelegantly. It's an idiotic point. In other words, if we go back to every administration since Nixon, this notion of no daylight simply doesn't exist. The idea that there isn't going to be public differences between the state of Israel and the United States has never been the reality under a single president. Never. And, to create this sort of illusory ideal that this has been the policy that has guided America in the past until the Obama administration is simply disconnected from reality. I mean, I was stunned. I mean, that's obviously a central thesis of the book.
Yes.
There shouldn't be daylight. There's always been daylight, and there have always been policy differences with every administration, and then you work them through. That's one. Number two, he acknowledges, and if you read the book, I mean, specifically, I read these sections. he acknowledges the fact that on the security front, that the president has been as good as he says and as the administration says.
Although he does say, Eric, that the president was hesitant to give Israel military support during the war in Gaza.
Look, part of the problem with the book is, first of all, it's a meandering book, and you can make virtually any argument from the book because he runs through in great detail, much more detail as necessary that people will ever read, a whole series of events, and he makes a number of arguments from both sides. But the overall thrust, and read the section when he talks about this specific argument that the United States has been supportive on the security military front, and he is very clear there that overall that they have done only a good job but a superb job.
Yes.
I mean, his point is that because diplomatically they have not been as supportive, that it ultimately undermines Israel because you have to back Israel completely on both fronts. I mean, that's the argument that he makes. But when you read the book, I mean, you understand that this sort of black and white Obama is anti-Israel is not true, and not even Oren isn't even saying that.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the problem is in the way the book has been presented, including by Michael Oren, the impression is giving that we simply have a deeply and profoundly anti-Israel president, which in my view is not the case, even though I disagree with the administration on Iran, which is not a small issue, it's a big issue.
Yes. Incidentally, Eric, you have been seen as somebody who has, in general, supported Barack Obama. In terms of his Middle East policy and in terms of his Iranian policy, has he disappointed you?
Look, in terms of the Iran issue, the answer is yes. I think they're misreading the issues, that they are inappropriately downplaying the risks, and I think the cost will be very great, potentially not only to Israel but to American interests and to the stability of the region. So, and I've been consistent on that point. I am generally sympathetic to the president on many fronts, particularly domestically. His foreign policy is mixed. Good in some areas, not so good in others. I mean, obviously,
Yep.
Iran is not a small matter; it's a big matter.
Yes.
But on the other hand, it's a complicated picture, and the black and white presentation of Oren, I think, is not helpful, and ultimately, offends the facts.
Eric, it is always so wonderful to talk to you and get your opinion. I am very grateful for you giving us some time. You know I chase you all the time. I'll continue to do so. So you be well until you either come to the studio or we speak again on the phone.
Okay. Always a pleasure being with you, Mark, and I'll look forward to talking to you
Thank
again.
you very, very much, Eric.
Right.
Eric Yoffie, former president of the Union For Reform Judaism, and a columnist now who writes for Haaretz, the Huffington Post, Jerusalem Post, and you can read him yourself at ericyoffie.com. One of the things that Eric says that's so important is very few things in life are black and white. And the Oren book raises all kinds of issues. We shouldn't see them in terms of black and white. By the way, we will be covering many of Michael Oren's speaking engagements here on JBS, so you'll get to hear what Michael Oren is saying himself about his book. My thanks to Director Sloan Copeland, Production Coordinator Serge Goldberg, Dara Golub, Associate Director of JBS, and to the producer of this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.